Mm-hmm.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Gen Z as Managers. My name is Jordan Kibley, and I'll be your facilitator. Your presenter today is Julie Coates, Senior Vice President at Learn. During this session, we ask that you please type your questions or comments into the session Q&A, and please remember to upvote any questions you think are important using the thumbs up button. This increases the chances of those questions getting asked and answered. At the end of the session, I'll read your questions to Julie, starting with the highest upvoted and continue until we run out of time. You may turn on captions by hovering over the video stream on your screen and clicking CC close captions button. Remember that we always start and end on time, and I'll turn it over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to talk about this topic. It's a new one because Gen Z is new to management. And in fact, there aren't very many people in this generation who are in the ranks of management today. This is a photograph of a Gen Z manager whom I know and who has provided consulting with me on what it's like to be a manager in this generation and has helped give me some perspective on some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So we know there's a lot out there about how to manage Gen Z, but there isn't a whole lot of information available on how to work with a Gen Z boss. One thing we do know is that for most of us, that will mean working for someone who's younger than we are. And although we may have some experience with it with millennials, that is increasingly going to be a situation for those of us who have been in the workforce for a while. If you're my age, and even if you're Gen X, we tend to think of Gen Z as kids, even just teenagers, but in reality, the oldest in this group are approaching 30. And increasingly, they are entering the ranks of management in the workplace. You can be very sure they're going to manage differently from older generations. And what I want to do with this presentation is not just look at a bunch of traits of Gen Z. We are going to do that. But I want to look at some of the experiences this generation has had in their coming of age years and talk a little bit about how that may influence how they manage. So here's what I just said I wasn't going to do. Here's the characteristics. And we're not going to talk about these because you can all read and you can all Google, so you can go online and you can find this information. It's very prevalent on the internet to see what are listed, the things that are listed as characteristics of Gen Z. What I want to do is emphasize the idea that the generations are a lens that we need to look through to help us understand the societal changes and the changes in the larger environment that shape the behaviors that we see among generations in the world around us. Not to go beyond just a label that oversimplifies differences in generational groups. We've tended to do too much of that in the past, and I think, especially with Gen Z, we need to take a different look. So, who is Gen Z? We'll start with this. Let's see where they are in the workforce today. You can see here it's broken down by generation, which I will emphasize throughout this presentation really is age cohorts more than true generations. And we still have 2% of the workplace are members of the silent generation, and those are people who were born before 1946. Depending on where you get your numbers, these other percentages are not absolutely precise because different analysts use different dates for the various generations. So we still have, to many people's surprise, about 20% of the workforce made up of baby boomers. 35% is Gen X. Millennials are currently the largest segment of the workforce at close to 40%. And Gen Z right now is a small segment, about 6% of the workforce. Combined with millennials, that is a pretty hefty segment of the workforce today. I typically don't lump millennials and Gen Z together because even though they're both younger generations, they are different in many ways. But for some key values and preferences, particularly as it relates to work, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of similarities in how these generations think. One of the things that we hear is that Gen Z is really difficult to work with. And here's a survey that said, yes, we had to fire these Gen Z people because they're just so hard to work with. But a better question might be, are they entitled and lazy and unmotivated and unproductive and difficult? Or do they just want something different from what you want and what people may have traditionally wanted in the workplace? This is a question that we need to ask, and there's an understanding we need to have that these characteristics have been applied to every generation when they enter the workforce in their late teens and early 20s. Part of it just has to do with their stage of development as human beings, and it changes over time. But we don't ever learn because we pass, whichever generation gets labeled as slackers and lazy and unmotivated and disrespectful and all of those things that we do, they do it to the subsequent generation coming along behind them. So let's take a kind of a look at that. This is what young adults looked like in 1920. And so let's say 1923, 100 years ago. And they were considered the most entitled generation in history. And they engaged in all kinds of behavior that were simply scandalous. They did wild dances like the Boston Two-Step. Their lives were forever changed by technology, like the radio and cars that let them go out unchaperoned on dates for the first time in history. They had a strong resistance to traditional values. They showed a little skin, and look at this, you can actually see their socks here, which is pretty scandalous. They bobbed their hair, and I think this is an actual piece of flesh here, this knee. So this is pretty horrible stuff because this was the younger generation. And yet this is the generation, these young people or people this age marched off into World War II in the 1940s, and they became the greatest generation. So we need to understand that these kinds of things are part of human development as much as they are characteristics of a particular generation. They're characteristics at a point in time. Some things that members of the younger generation in 1920 experienced are very parallel to things that we're seeing in society today. And I would suggest that we might see some similar kinds of behaviors that that are exhibited by young people today. A surge in white supremacy, for example, and we're certainly seeing that in our country today. It was a time of domestic conflict, and when the 20s began, there were striking differences between rural and urban America, and we sure see that rural-urban conflict playing out in our society today. Urban Americans enjoyed a different standard of living and embraced a more modern worldview. They tended to have a greater value for education. They advocated science, social change. They were the woke people of the 1920s, and it's not unlike that today. The difference is education went up in the 1920s, when people were increasingly becoming high school graduates. Today, we see a higher percentage of young people becoming college graduates. And there was a huge fear of immigration. There was a fear that American liberties were under assault. There was a rise in fundamentalism in religion, a loss of a faith in science, which we also are experiencing very strongly today. There was global and domestic insecurity for young people in 1920. So these are the things that were parallel at that time, and yet young people in that generation made some of the most significant changes to our society and most positive changes to our society in our history. They're still called, as we said, the greatest generation. Those people who came of age in the 1920s. Today, if I walk down the street in Portland, Oregon, what I see is this picture that you see on the bottom of the page. In 1920, if a person had walked down the street, what they would have seen was that image at the top of the page. So that rise in poverty and lack of resources and access to the benefits of the country that we live in were as pronounced 100 years ago as they are now. A surge of homelessness and poverty plagued the nation. And this is the world that Gen Z knows and inhabits. Understanding how that affects their worldview is critical to understanding why they behave as they do. And the reason I focus on this is because this is going to impact how they manage and how they behave at work, because the values they developed are not going to be isolated outside of work. Other things that were similar, we had the COVID and social isolation in 2020. Previous generations had the flu epidemic in 1918 through the early 1920s. So there was a global pandemic that impacted how people saw the world. Then and now, young people have seen their parents laid off, the economy disrupted, the government fractured. The Great Depression came at the end of the 1920s. The environment is now at risk for the younger generation, and anxiety and depression is at an all-time high. One of the things that we often do, those of us in older generations, is dismiss the validity of that anxiety, that depression, with things like, well, you know, things were tough for us too, but we got through it, and we don't know why these kids should have so much trouble. We worried about nuclear war. We certainly did. But we didn't worry about the entire world ceasing to exist as a result of climate change. And that is a real fear for younger generations. So here's some facts about this generation that is moving into the workplace and moving into management. First of all, they're more likely to have a college-educated parent than anyone in a previous generation. And they're also more likely to be enrolled in college or have a college degree themselves. They are, at this point, going to be one of the highest educated or the highest educated generation in history. They're less likely to be working now than previous generations at their age. Partly because they're focused on school more than previous generations, and partly because of complex social issues where the culture of work is not amenable to the aspirations of Gen Z. That's not the same as saying people just don't want to work these days. That's saying younger people have different drivers for what makes them want to be in the workplace, and they have more demands about what they need to see in the workplace. Very few want to work for a substandard wage that doesn't allow them to pay for basic necessities, whereas previous generations didn't face that same kind of challenge. They're slightly less likely to be immigrants than millennials were, but they're more likely to be the children of immigrations, to be second generation. So we are seeing the increasing diversity among this generation, and that is also a very influential factor for this generation in the workplace. 1 in 4 members of Gen Z are Hispanic. The most common surname in the United States today is still Smith, followed by Rodriguez and Gonzalez. So we see that demographic shift playing out every day as we go about our normal activities. And the views of Gen Z mirror millennials in a lot of ways. And they have a different outlook. For example, Gen Z and millennials are more likely than older generations to want an activist government, to want a government that's going to do something to solve some of the social problems, some of the environmental problems, some of the economic problems, the infrastructure problems, and other kinds of challenges that we're facing today. For those of you who are, probably no one in this audience is close to my age, but if you were, you would remember the president in the past who took the greatest, made the greatest steps in addressing those kinds of problems for our nation was FDR. We've systematically, over the last few decades, dismantled the programs that FDR put into place that established the middle class, that provided social safety nets, that allowed for the resolution of a lot of the problems that plagued the country at that point in history. And what we see is a generation that mirrors, again, that greatest generation who wanted an activist government and believed that that's what we needed in order to solve some of the problems that our population faced. And then, of course, there is the issue of climate change And the younger generations, Gen Z, is very concerned about the impact of that on society, and it impacts many of their behaviors. The young manager whose picture I showed you has eliminated all the environmentally unsound products in her business, and has instituted policies that will help minimize carbon footprint of the business that she is responsible for management. And we see different issues about how people view race in the country. We're looking at Republicans here because it tends to be a more conservative element of our political spectrum. But younger people who identify as Republican are far more likely than older people to believe that there is disparity in how people are treated. Some of that comes absolutely from being part of a diverse environment, a diverse nation, but that is going to play out in workplace policies and in how people relate to each other and how people work together within organizations in the future. It's going to be a very different kind of world. About half of Gen Z and millennials think that same-sex marriage is good for society. And I don't know, I guess I don't know why it's good for society, but the thing that does strike me about this is that for this generation, gender identity doesn't make a difference. It simply is part of a reality, and it doesn't influence how people relate to each other in the ways that it did decades ago for Gen X and for baby boomers. And it's going to make a difference again in the workplace and how people manage, how people relate, and how people provide support for the employees that they are responsible to manage. So, of course, they're more likely to know someone who uses gender neutral pronouns, and to know people who do not consider themselves binary. And that's a huge change from the way the world was when older managers who are in the workplace today were more numerous. One of the things that we need to keep in mind too is when we look at the fact that 20% of the workforce is still boomers, a lot of that 20% are still managers. They've been there a long time. Age, experience has moved them into management and has kept them in management for all of those years. And there is bound to be conflict. They are bound to see Gen Z as being difficult because this is a generation that thinks very differently. So the question is, it comes up, what is normal? My assertion is that no one is normal for Gen Z because everything is normal. It's normal for people not to identify as binary. It's normal for people to be of mixed race. It's normal not to be like the majority. There is so much more individualism and so much more acceptance of difference than there ever has been. And in this new world, where we have all this diversity and we have all these factors that are part of how people see the world, Success is dependent not on excluding people that don't fit the mold, if you will, but success depends on embracing differences and turning those differences into assets that can help support and build organizations. And we're going to see that play out increasingly as Gen Z moves more into management. We talk a lot about the new normal, and one of the things that I would assert is that Gen Z represents the new normal. It's going to be a normal that is far different from what we see now, with different emphasis placed on productivity, motivation, workplace behaviors than we have ever seen before. We can't talk about Gen Z without taking into account the upending experiences of the past 5 years, the global pandemic. Some historians say that was as influential in the lives of Gen Z as World War II was for those who served and lived through it, and as the Great Depression, as for my generation, Vietnam. The world as we knew it was changed by those events, and the world was changed again with the pandemic. So this new normal is going to change society as profoundly as the greatest generation did 100 years ago. We're never going to return to the way things used to be. Again, for those of us, many people my age, we long for things to be the way they used to be and go back to what we call the good old days. But good old days are different now from what they used to be, and we are never going back there. The new normal is going to be driven by a massive shift in social consciousness because of demographics and because of the enduring impact of the adaptive change made necessary by changes in the world, including the COVID pandemic. It killed more Americans than World War I and Vietnam combined, for example. It pushed unemployment rates to levels that hadn't been seen since the 1930s. It caused so many people to lose their jobs, lose their homes. And it was just one of many overlapping crises that this young generation came of age in. So if we wonder why this generation is anxious and depressed, we have some good reasons for that, but it is an adaptive generation. And let's look at this, because I find this to be really heartening. During the recession in 2008, worry and stress went up 3 to 5 percentage points. But between summer and March in 2020, stress went up 14 percentage points. 60% of Americans experience significant stress. And that was an increase over an already high 46%. So we see that in young people coming into the workplace today. So this was a study that asked young people to self-identify what they preferred in terms of their leadership style. And this is what Gen Z came up with, and I think this is fantastic. 26% said they prefer a democratic management style. 25% said that they prefer an affiliative management style. And if you don't know what an affiliative management style is, it means a style that promotes positivity and harmony in the workplace, focuses on team building, creates personal connections among workers, creates trust, and looks for social and emotional cohesion at work and minimizes conflict. That's over half of members of this generation who look to a more inclusive and participatory kinds of management that's more or leadership, which will, of course, inform management than previous generations. Only 5% prefer this autocratic style. If you Google the preferred management style of baby boomers, autocratic is what is number one. So we see this is going to make a huge change in how this generation manages in the workplace. And I don't see that it is going to change a lot as this generation matures. Young workers are increasingly moving into positions without a lot of experience. But one of the things that, and baby boomers worry about that, but baby boomers did the same thing. There were so many of them coming into the workplace, and the workplace had to accommodate them, and many came into positions of responsibility at a very young age with minimal experience. Corporate leadership is typically associated with experience and age, but new generations of workers are challenging this idea and doing so successfully. They're founding companies, they're running major initiatives within existing enterprises, they're bringing new perspectives, new ideas, new approaches, and as we have said, that different mindset into management. One thing that makes this generation more likely to be successful moving into these management positions at a young age is that they are eager to learn and open to learn. And this is very important as we look at the transition and succession from older types of leadership to new and young leaders. Here's some of the things that Gen Z say they want at work. And if we look at all of the social factors, which we just have, that impact them, and at the kinds of challenges they face every day in their lives, we can understand this a little bit better. I was reading a course syllabus from a local university the other day, and one of the professors, who is a millennial, had put in his syllabus all the deadlines and requirements for courses and homework and all that stuff. And then at the bottom, he had put life happens. If something interferes with you meeting these deadlines and requirements, come and talk to me and we'll figure it out. I never saw that in a syllabus before. And I think that is responsiveness from a younger person who's probably experienced it to an even younger generation. This was a millennial professor working with even younger students because he understands the kinds of challenges that this generation is facing in the world. Gen Z, interestingly, they ranked empathy is the second most important trait in a boss. Bosses had it listed as the fifth most important. But for this generation, it's a prerequisite to taking on more responsibility and increasing engagement. And bosses who don't show empathy run the risk of losing their employees. One of the big complaints is that Gen Z employees move on too soon. They don't have enough loyalty. They disengage. But lack of empathy, well, you know, as your mother always said, every story has two sides. But disengagement, lost productivity, increased turnover can be a direct result of not having the kind of leaderships that is necessary to support these younger workers. And this is what Gen Z wants in the workplace, and this is what Gen Z managers will bring to the workplace. The young woman whose photograph I showed you on the very first slide had a policy that if one of her employees was experiencing a particularly stressful time, she would make that employee go for a walk. She would say, go away, walk, compose yourself, come back. We will talk. You don't have to worry. I understand what's going on with your life. Her employees were extremely loyal and extremely productive because of her approach and understanding of the experiences that they were dealing with. She kept them engaged and she kept her turnover to a minimum. We've talked about stress and we've talked about stress, but this is another thing that Gen Z workers will bring as managers to the workplace and that they expect in the workplace. Everything from a healthy workload to being able to balance their life with their work will help them to be more engaged and help them feel more valued. They are going to force this change in the workplace. Gen Z wants meaningful and purposeful work. A lot has been written, as we said, about how fickle they are, and they're known for leaving their job after a short time, but employers consider this a lack of loyalty. Gen Z workers, however, want their work to have purpose. And it's going to be critical for them in the workplace to have an environment that responds to their needs and responds to specifically their need to know that their work counts. And this goes beyond just having their name listed on the recognition board as Employee of the Week. This goes to a greater acknowledgement of their contributions and their innovations, their solutions to problems in a meaningful way. When this happens, engagement is higher and turnover is less. And Gen Z, as a manager, will bring this to the workplace. Gen Z, we talked about this, but Gen Z values learning. And statistics confirm that their Gen Z who are learning skills they need for the future are more than twice as likely to stay at their current job if their work has meaning and if it has a potential for advancement. And of course, everybody wants reward and recognition. That just goes without saying. But this is also true of younger workers, and this is something that Gen Z managers are going to implement effectively. In today's overbusy world, time is an important currency, and it is one of the most important rewards for this generation. So this generation wants to know they're taken seriously, that their ideas, even if their ideas are not inside the box, and they're going to welcome that as managers. Purpose-driven leadership. They want to matter, and they want their work to matter. Like the young manager that I talked about, investing in responsible and sustainable business has helped keep her employees engaged and happy and reduce turnover. Honesty, trust, and respect. We say these for every generation, but a lot of Gen Z, 31% of Gen Z workers will choose to work for employers who prioritize diversity and inclusion, compared to 11% of Gen X and 13% of millennials. These leaders encourage open dialogue, seek input from team members, leverage the strength of every individual to foster an environment where everyone feels valued. That is what we talked about with affiliative leadership. This generation will provide the opportunity for learning because learning never ends. The ever-changing nature of modern work demands adaptability and agility. And when Gen Z members have regular access to learning opportunities, both formal and informal, their productivity and their engagement increases. This is part of career advancement, and it is highly valued. There are some advantages of working for a Gen Z boss. They bring a philosophy of work that might conflict with convention, but they also bring things that are highly valuable. A fresh perspective, innovation, technological expertise, adaptability and resilience, because the world has demanded it of them. Diversity and inclusional focus, collaboration skills, multitasking, and social and environmental consciousness. So when we look at this generation and we look at what they have experienced and the way it has shaped their values and their philosophies, we can anticipate that as Gen Z moves into leadership, increasingly, we are going to see very different structures within the workplace, and those are going to benefit everyone. We don't have to go through this list, but here are some of the key values expressed by members of this generation. I've put some resources here at the end for you where you can look up some of these, and the slides are also available with notes as handouts for you after the session. Thank you very much for being here. We look forward to working with all of you in an ongoing way to provide you with services and support to make your programs even more successful than they are, and to provide you with the support you need. Thank you all very much.
All right, so we're out of time, but there are a few questions in Whova. So Julie will go in and answer those for you guys.
I will.
The session's over. Thank you so much, Julie. And
Thank you.
the attendees, make sure to complete the session evaluation and let us know how much you enjoyed the presentation. The evaluation is posted on the session page right under the viewing screen. To complete it, just click on rate session. All right, thanks again, guys. Have a good one, and we'll see you at the next session.
Thank you all.